Everyone thinks they already know how this story goes. A hyped rookie steps into the league, struggles early, and gets quietly labeled as another name that didn't pan out. That's the box Shedeur Sanders was shoved into almost immediately. Missed throws, too many hits, too many sacks, too many people saying the game looked too fast. But here's the uncomfortable truth most fans never stop to consider. What if Sanders didn't fail at all? What if the environment failed him first? Because when you slow the tape down and strip away the noise, the version of events most people accepted starts to fall apart fast. Sanders wasn't dropped into a clean NFL situation and exposed. He was dropped into chaos and expected to survive it. From the opening weeks of his rookie season with the Cleveland Browns, protection collapsed almost instantly. Pockets dissolved before routes could develop. Reads were rushed not because of poor processing, but because pressure arrived on step 2 instead of step 5. That doesn't just disrupt drives, it rewires how a quarterback plays. Mechanics shorten, eyes drop, trust disappears. And once that happens, the box score stops telling the real story. What looked like inconsistency on Sundays was often a quarterback playing defense against his own situation. That's where this narrative takes a sharp turn, because inside the Browns building, the conclusion wasn't what the outside world ran with. There's been quiet buzz that internal evaluations painted a very different picture of Shedeur Sanders' rookie year. Not excuses, context. Coaches reportedly saw a quarterback who still won from clean pockets, who delivered on timing concepts when he wasn't bracing for contact, and who didn't lose his football instincts, he just never had room to use them. That distinction matters because it changes what comes next. It turns, "Does this quarterback have it?" into, "Why hasn't he been allowed to show it?" And that's why the real story here isn't about a second chance. It's about something Sanders never actually had in the first place, a fair one. Cleveland didn't just acknowledge that quietly. They moved in a way franchises almost never do when they think a quarterback is the problem. They stopped hedging, they stopped leaking uncertainty, and they made a decision that signaled something far bigger than optimism. Because when a team truly believes the quarterback isn't broken, they don't replace him, they rebuild everything around him. And that's exactly where this gets interesting. The easiest thing to do after a rough rookie season is to stop at the surface, look at the stat line, circle the lows, and move on. That's exactly what happened with Shedeur Sanders. Completion percentage dipped, turnovers climbed. The highlight shows were quick to frame it as a learning curve, or worse, a warning sign. But that version of the story ignores what actually unfolded snap by snap. Sanders wasn't playing quarterback the way most rookies do. He was playing damage control from the opening drive of the season. Week after week, the same pattern replayed itself. Protection didn't just break down, it broke down instantly. Edge rushers arrived untouched. Interior pressure collapsed the pocket before Sanders could even finish his drop. There was no rhythm to establish, no consistency to lean on. Routes designed to hit on timing never had time to breathe. That forces a young quarterback into survival mode, and once you're there, every decision becomes reactive instead of calculated. Throws get rushed, footwork gets compressed, and suddenly what looks like poor play is really just controlled chaos. This wasn't a one-off issue or an adjustment problem that ironed itself out as the season went on. It followed Sanders from his final year in college straight into the NFL. The transition wasn't from comfort to difficulty, it was from one collapsing pocket into another. Defensive linemen lived in the backfield. Free rushers dictated his internal clock. When analysts pointed to pocket presence as a weakness, they ignored the reality that there often wasn't a pocket to sense in the first place. Even veteran quarterbacks struggle under that kind of pressure. For a rookie, it's a setup that bends habits and distorts evaluation. And that's what made the criticism so unfair. Sanders wasn't struggling because the NFL was too fast mentally. He was struggling because it was too fast physically. When the ball has to come out before the route hits its break, accuracy suffers. When eyes are forced off downfield reads to locate pressure, interceptions climb. None of that speaks to intelligence or ceiling, it speaks to circumstances. Circumstances that quietly buried the parts of Sanders' game that made him special in the first place. Because when the rare, clean pocket did appear, something telling happened. The offense settled. The ball came out on schedule. The throws looked sharp and decisive. Those moments were glimpses, not of potential, but of something already there waiting to be unlocked. They didn't last long, but they existed often enough to raise a troubling question for anyone paying close attention. If this quarterback can function like that with even a second of protection, why is the narrative treating his rookie year as a verdict instead of a warning? And that question leads directly to what Cleveland saw when they went back to the tape, because the deeper they looked, the less blame landed on Sanders and the more it landed somewhere else. Once Cleveland went back to the film, the conversation shifted in a way the public never got to hear. The tape didn't match the narrative. On the surface, Shedeur Sanders looked hurried and inconsistent, but when coaches isolated plays where protection actually held up, a very different quarterback appeared. Feet were calm, eyes stayed downfield, the ball came out on time and with authority. Those reps weren't flukes, they followed a clear pattern that kept showing up again and again whenever the pocket gave him even a brief window to operate. That split became impossible to ignore. On clean pocket snaps, Sanders looked like a composed rhythm passer, hitting intermediate routes with anticipation and throwing receivers open rather than waiting for them to flash free. The mechanical breakdowns critics love to point out weren't habits, they were reactions. Film revealed that many of his bad decisions came on plays where protection failed immediately, forcing him to throw while fading, reset his feet mid-motion, or rush a read that was never designed to come out that fast. When people said the game looked fast, they weren't wrong. But it wasn't fast because defenses disguising coverages. It was fast because defenders were already in his lap. There's also been quiet chatter around league circles that Sanders' internal grades were noticeably higher than the public would expect. Not official, not something Cleveland ever announced, but reportedly enough to convince the staff that the raw numbers were misleading. Coaches don't care about surface stats the way fans do. They care about repeatable traits. Eye discipline, timing, how a quarterback responds when the design actually works. And when the Browns evaluators isolated those moments, they didn't see a player losing confidence. They saw someone still trying to play the position correctly, even when the environment made that nearly impossible. What stood out most on film was how little Sanders' instinctive processing actually deteriorated. Even under pressure, he continued working through progressions until contact forced him off platform. That matters because it shows trust in the structure, not panic. Quarterbacks who truly lose it stop reading and start guessing. Sanders didn't guess, he just ran out of time. And when time exists, everything about his game snaps back into place. The contrast was so sharp that it reframed the entire evaluation. The issue wasn't whether he could play. The issue was whether the system would ever allow him to. That realization forced Cleveland into a choice most franchises avoid: either accept the numbers at face value and start planning a replacement, or admit something far more uncomfortable, that the organization itself had contributed to the problem. And if the second option is true, then fixing the quarterback doesn't start with tweaking his mechanics or speeding up his reads. It starts with fixing what's in front of him. That's the moment where this situation stopped being about film study and started becoming about accountability, because once the tape told the truth, the next move had to prove they actually believed it. When Todd Monken stepped into the building, he didn't do what most new head coaches do. There was no calculated ambiguity, no open competition talk, no hedging language meant to keep every option on the table. Instead, Monken made a declaration that instantly reset the power structure inside the organization. Shedeur Sanders wasn't going to be evaluated quietly behind closed doors. He was named the top priority out loud, on the record, with no asterisks attached. In a league where coaches guard their words like trade secrets, that kind of clarity almost never happens by accident. That statement wasn't about hype, It was about alignment. By saying it publicly, Monken wasn't just backing his quarterback, he was issuing a directive to everyone else in the building. Scouting, analytics, player development, strength staff, cap management, all of it now had a single point of reference. If a decision didn't help Sanders develop, it no longer made sense. That's a dramatic shift for a franchise that spent years living in quarterback uncertainty. And it sent a message that Cleveland wasn't preparing to replace Sanders, they were preparing to reveal him. What made the declaration even more unusual was the timing. Sanders was coming off a rookie year that critics tore apart. Most coaches would have used that moment to lower expectations or create distance. Monken did the opposite. He essentially said the evaluation had already happened, and the conclusion was clear. The problem wasn't talent, the problem was structure. That kind of stance doesn't come from optimism alone. It comes from film, from data, and from confidence in what you know you can fix. This wasn't a motivational soundbite meant to win a press conference. It was a line in the sand. Monken tied his reputation to Sanders' development before running a single practice. That's a dangerous move, unless you believe deeply in two things: the quarterback's ceiling and your ability to design an environment that unlocks it. And that's where Monken's history mattered. He's built offenses around very different types of quarterbacks before. He understands that forcing a system onto a player doesn't create growth, it creates failure. Once that declaration was made, the clock started ticking. Words like that demand action. They require proof, not in promises, but in personnel. And if Monken truly believed Sanders was the guy, the next move had to address the one thing the film made undeniable. The quarterback didn't need a reset, the protection did. What followed wasn't flashy, but it was revealing, and it confirmed that Monken's declaration wasn't empty confidence, it was the first step in a much bigger plan. The moment Cleveland made its next move, the truth slipped out quietly, not through a headline quarterback signing or a flashy offensive announcement, but through a hire that told anyone paying attention exactly what the organization believed. George Warhop didn't arrive as a splash, he arrived as a confession, because teams don't hire a 30-year trench veteran unless they've already admitted where things went wrong. This wasn't about upgrading talent, this was about undoing damage.
Warhop wasn't brought in to tweak schemes or install buzzword concepts. He was hired to fix the single most destructive variable in Shedeur Sanders' rookie year: protection that broke down before plays even had a chance to exist. That matters, because if Cleveland believed Sanders was the problem, this hire never happens. You don't invest in elite infrastructure for a quarterback you plan to replace. You do it for one you're convinced deserves a clean evaluation. What made the hire even more revealing was how specific it was. Warhop isn't trendy. He's not tied to college spread systems or experimental protections. He's coached through every evolution of NFL offensive line play, and more importantly, he's seen what happens when young quarterbacks are asked to survive without structure. His reputation isn't built on reinventing the position, it's built on discipline, cohesion, and turning unstable lines into predictable ones. That's not exciting on social media, but it's everything to a rhythm passer who wins on timing and anticipation. There was also a familiarity layer that made this feel intentional rather than coincidental. Warhop knows Cleveland. He's coached there before. He understands the pressure, the media cycles, and the way instability compounds when mistakes pile up. There's no learning curve here, no adjustment period. That alone signals urgency. Cleveland didn't hire for potential, they hired for immediate correction. This was the organization saying, without saying it, that Shedeur Sanders' rookie year was compromised long before the ball ever left his hand. And that's the part that exposed the truth. If last season had simply revealed Sanders' limitations, the fix would have targeted him directly. Mechanics coach, new play caller, competition language. Instead, the Browns went straight to the foundation. They chose accountability over alibis. Warhop's presence reframes the entire evaluation because it confirms what the tape already suggested. The quarterback wasn't broken, the environment was. And once that admission is made, everything else that follows becomes less about excuses and more about execution. Because now the organization has taken ownership of the problem it spent a year pretending didn't exist. What makes this shift so significant is that Cleveland isn't just fixing problems, they're building with intent. Everything about this new direction points to one central truth. The system being installed isn't generic, and it isn't borrowed. It's being shaped specifically around Shedeur Sanders and the way he actually plays the position. That distinction matters because too many young quarterbacks fail not due to lack of ability, but because they're forced into systems that ask them to become someone they're not. Sanders is not a chaos quarterback. He's not at his best freelancing outside the pocket or turning broken plays into magic. His game lives in rhythm, in anticipation, in timing throws that hit before defenders can react. He wants clean drops, clear reads, and routes that unfold on schedule. When those pieces line up, his accuracy and composure show up immediately. That's why protection isn't just important for him, it's essential. Without it, the very traits that make him effective get muted, sometimes erased entirely. This is where Todd Monken earns the benefit of the doubt. Monken's reputation was built around maximizing very different quarterback skill sets, including his work with Lamar Jackson, a player who thrives on movement, unpredictability, and off-script creation. Sanders is the opposite archetype, and instead of trying to bend him into a familiar mold, Monken pivoted. That adaptability is rare. Most offensive minds have a system and expect the quarterback to conform. Monken has shown he's willing to flip that equation. The concepts being emphasized now reflect that shift. More timing-based routes, more progression-friendly designs, less reliance on improvisation, and more on structure. The goal isn't to make Sanders faster mentally, it's to slow the game down physically so his processing can shine. That only works when protection allows him to stay balanced and decisive. With George Warhop tasked with stabilizing the front, the offense finally has a chance to function as intended rather than react to breakdowns. This approach also explains why there's no talk of reinventing Sanders, no public hints that he needs to play looser or scramble more, no subtle pressure to change his identity. Instead, the message has been consistent. Give him time and let him operate. That's a philosophical commitment, not a coaching tweak. It signals that Cleveland believes Sanders' best football doesn't require transformation. It requires permission to be played the right way. And that's what makes this system feel different from past Browns experiments. It's not built around trends or theoretical upside. It's built around one quarterback's strengths, and that clarity cuts through a lot of the noise that usually follows a young player after a rough start. Because when an offense is designed for rhythm and protection instead of damage control, the evaluation becomes honest, and honest evaluations tend to change narratives fast. For years, Cleveland followed a familiar and destructive pattern. When things went wrong, the quarterback absorbed the blame. New name, new scheme, same outcome. The organization cycled through passers, coaches, and philosophies as if instability itself was a strategy. What never changed was the assumption at the center of it all. If the offense stalled, the quarterback must be the problem. That mindset quietly sabotaged more careers than the Browns ever admitted, and Shedeur Sanders was on track to become the next casualty. This time, something broke that pattern. Instead of repeating the usual script, Cleveland did something far more uncomfortable. They looked inward. They acknowledged that the chaos surrounding Sanders wasn't incidental, it was structural. Protection issues weren't bad luck, they were consequences. Schemes that demanded timing without providing time weren't growing pains, they were contradictions. By hiring experience, realigning priorities, and publicly committing to one developmental path, the Browns effectively admitted what they'd avoided for years. The failure wasn't the quarterback, it was the environment the quarterback was forced to operate in. That admission explains why this reset feels different. It's not about tearing everything down or chasing the next shiny solution. It's about correcting foundational errors the franchise kept stepping around instead of through. Cleveland leaned heavily on experimentation in the past, rotating philosophies and hoping one would stick long enough to mask deeper flaws. What they lacked was identity, a consistent infrastructure that gave their quarterback a fighting chance regardless of who was under center. That's what they're finally trying to build now. There's also a noticeable change in how responsibility is being distributed. The language has shifted away from pressure on Sanders to prove it and toward obligation on the organization to provide it. Coaching hires weren't made for upside, they were made for reliability. The offense isn't being rebuilt to look innovative on paper, it's being engineered to function every Sunday. That kind of thinking only happens when a franchise admits it's been evaluating the wrong variables for far too long. And once that mistake is acknowledged, the entire timeline changes. The rookie year stops being a verdict and becomes evidence of what happens when structure is missing. Cleveland isn't rewriting history, they're correcting course. And in doing so, they've turned what was once a revolving door into a commitment with stakes. Because when you finally admit where you went wrong, the next season isn't about hope anymore. It's about proof.
That's what makes 2026 so different. This isn't a rebuild disguised by optimism or another wait-and-see season padded with excuses. This is a reckoning. The Browns have removed the ambiguity that usually protects organizations from accountability, and in doing so, they've raised the stakes for everyone involved. Shedeur Sanders isn't being evaluated in chaos anymore. He's being evaluated in structure, and that changes everything. For the first time, Cleveland is entering a season with alignment instead of uncertainty. There's no quarterback competition whisper campaign, no mixed messaging, no fallback narrative being prepared in case things go sideways. The organization has already decided that Sanders deserves a real evaluation, and now they've built the infrastructure to make that evaluation honest. Protection is being prioritized. The offense is being tailored. The developmental timeline has accelerated not because of pressure, but because the conditions are finally right to demand results. That's what turns this year into a line in the sand. If Sanders succeeds, the narrative flips fast. The rookie year criticism collapses under context, and Cleveland suddenly looks like a franchise that figured it out instead of tripping into another reset. And if he doesn't, there are no more structural alibis left. The Browns will know they gave him everything he needed. That clarity is rare in this league, and it's exactly why this season carries more weight than any rebuild label ever could. What also amplifies the moment is the rest of the roster. The defense, already stabilized under proven leadership, gives the offense breathing room it hasn't had in years. Sanders doesn't have to be heroic. He doesn't have to drag the team out of weekly disasters. He just has to operate the offense the way it was designed. That's a reasonable ask for a quarterback whose strengths were buried under dysfunction last season, and reasonable expectations are often where real growth happens. So 2026 isn't about patience, it's about answers. Cleveland has finally stripped the situation down to its essentials: protection, scheme, and quarterback fit. No distractions, no narrative gymnastics, just execution. Whatever happens next won't be confusing or clouded. It will be definitive. And that's why this moment matters so much, because franchises don't usually get to choose when clarity arrives. Cleveland forced it. Now the spotlight is on, and the outcome will reshape how this entire era of Browns football is remembered. Here's the part that feels uncomfortable for a lot of people to admit. The story we've been telling about Shedeur Sanders might be wrong. Not incomplete, not exaggerated, flat out misread. His rookie year was treated like a verdict when it was really a warning about what happens when a quarterback is judged before the environment around him is built to function. And now that environment is finally taking shape. Cleveland isn't promising miracles. They aren't selling hype. They're doing something far more dangerous in the NFL. They're removing excuses. By committing to Sanders publicly, stabilizing protection, and designing an offense that matches how he actually plays, the Browns have set the stage for a clean evaluation. No noise, no chaos, just a quarterback operating in structure. And once that happens, narratives tend to break quickly because they can't hide behind context anymore. If Sanders succeeds, the league will have to revisit every lazy takeaway that followed his first year. The conversations about ceiling, readiness, and fit will shift overnight. What once looked like failure will be reclassified as mismanagement, and Cleveland, a franchise long defined by instability, will suddenly look like a team that learned from its mistakes instead of repeating them. That's how fast perception changes when structure meets talent.
But even if it doesn't work, the outcome will still matter. Because for the first time, the Browns are asking the right question. Not whether the quarterback can survive dysfunction, but whether he can thrive without it. That's the line that separates real evaluation from endless resets. And that's why this moment feels bigger than one player or one season. The narrative is about to collide with reality. Either way, the illusion is gone. What comes next won't be debated in hypotheticals or explained away by broken systems. It will be clear. And that clarity is exactly what this story has been missing all along.